This is WD
FM, the official Walt Disney Family Museum podcast. We're your hosts, Bri Bertolucci, Marketing Manager, and
Chris Mullen, Marketing Coordinator at the Walt Disney Family Museum. Today we are exploring the creation of Walt Disney's second feature-length animated film, Pinocchio. This film is built on the sophistication of the prior decade-plus of short films and the runaway success of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, and has been described by historians as the most beautifully realized and technically perfect of all the Disney animated features, and up to that point, the most expensive. Now that's some kind of praise, isn't it, Bri?
yeah, definitely. Compared to the epic of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, they must have really went above and beyond, as we'll learn today. And the film was really an epic of animated cinema. Pinocchio is full of moments of artistic beauty and fun entertainment. Walt Disney was as confident as ever, coming off the stunning critical and commercial success of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. He was anxious to put even more effort and dedication into the second feature. The result was a dazzling and classic film.
But what makes Pinocchio such an important film in Disney history? Well, beyond the laudable artistic merits of the film itself, Pinocchio represents Walt Disney at what film historian Leonard Maltin called, quote, the apex of what many of his later critics considered to be the realm of the animated cartoon. The film required the talents of 750 artists, including animators, assistants, in-betweeners, layout artists, background painters, special effects animators, and inkers and painters, who produced more than 2 million drawings and used some 1,500 shades of paint for the Technicolor production.
Well, Pinocchio didn't bankrupt the Disney studio, but for the first time since Walt had begun his meteoric rise, he encountered a disappointing return at the box office. To be sure, his career continued to thrive. Walt's vision was still brilliant and produced a remarkable series of classic films. But never again would there be a film quite like Pinocchio. A film so overflowing with artistic riches and celebrated with such abandon, the sheer joy of inspired creation.
Couldn't have said it any better myself. A wooden puppet is brought to life by the Blue Fairy, with the promise that he can become a real boy if he earns it. He is led astray by the wicked Honest John and his companion Gideon, who turn him over to an evil puppeteer, Stromboli. Pinocchio is sent to Pleasure Island, where the wicked boys are turned into donkeys, but he escapes thanks to his friend and conscience, Jiminy Cricket. He eventually redeems himself by saving his father, Geppetto, who had been swallowed by Monstro the whale. The Blue Fairy rewards Pinocchio by turning him into a real boy. Spoiler alert. But how did this story come to life?
Well, before Snow White was completed, Walt was laying plans for additional feature-length films. By the end of 1937, Bambi was in story development, and Walt was considering other stories as possible material for animated features. Candidates including classic stories like Alice in Wonderland, Peter Pan, Reynard the Fox, Hansel and Gretel, and Pinocchio. The Walt Disney Studios registered a priority on the title. Consider it like calling dibs on a particular story, with the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America as early as May 1934. The film wouldn't be completed for almost 6 years, so really thinking ahead. This was no more than just a precaution, reserving Pinocchio and many other titles. In 1935, Walt and Roy were absent from the studio, traveling with their wives across Europe. After visits to key spots in England, France, and Germany, the Disneys concluded their European adventure with 2 weeks in Italy. During this stretch, Walt gave numerous interviews and publicly discussed his interest in adapting Pinocchio. Among the hundreds of illustrated storybooks purchased on the European trip to be shipped back to the newly created studio library was a Solani edition of Pinocchio with illustrations by Maria Augusta Cavalieri and Luigi Cavalieri.
By 1937, Pinocchio was one of many ideas percolating in the Disney story department. With Snow White approaching completion, Walt began to intensify his focus onto some of those ideas. In the event that Snow White should prove successful enough to warrant further feature-length production, it was understood that Bambi, already in development, would be the second Disney feature. On the concept art and model sheets produced for Bambi at the time, you'll see the number 2, indicating Bambi as the intended second feature. Walt began considering follow-up ideas and asked studio attorney Gunther Lessing to inquire into the film rights to the original Pinocchio story by Carlo Collodi. Pinocchio was already in the public domain in many countries, including the United States, but in most European countries, including Italy, the story was still fully protected. The studio bargained directly with Collodi's original publisher, Bemparad, in 1937. By the end of the year, serious negotiations between Bemparad and Disney were underway. The contract was finalized in June 1938, by which time the studio was already well into production of the film. I guess, Bri, that's a good reason why Gunther Lessing, the studio attorney, was always called the only mister at the studios.
Because he clearly got the job done.
He was serious.
Recounting how the creative process began, Disney legends Frank Thomas and Ollie Johnston wrote in their book, Disney Animation, The Illusion of Life, quote, "Before any actual story work was begun, Walt would look for an artist of unique ability to make some drawings or paintings that would excite everybody. He brought in top illustrators of children's books, such as Gustav Tenggren, to explore the visual possibilities of a subject. These inspirational sketches started the whole staff thinking," end quote. Gustav Tenggren was an award-winning illustrator and worked on promotional materials and concept art for Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, earning him an even greater role in the next feature, Pinocchio. He contributed to the kind of lavish European storybook flavor that Walt envisioned. Even though the story of Pinocchio is unequivocally set in Italy, the film has a more generalized European setting, thanks to Tenggren's creative input on the interiors, exteriors, and woodwork.
Sounds a lot like Disneyland's Fantasyland now. The cast was also more generalized. Geppetto speaks in a German accent, Jiminy Cricket and Lampwick are American, the Coachman is Cockney, and only Stromboli bears an Italian accent. Collodi fans would later criticize this adaptation for not staying true to the Italian roots, among many of the changes that they made to the original story. Pinocchio has a large cast of characters adapted from the rich text of Carlo Collodi's novel.
Now, when reading Collodi's book, you wouldn't find the lovable and naive character of Pinocchio that we associate with the story today. The puppet depicted in the novel was a brash, overconfident, and obnoxious character who was constantly causing mischief. When Walt started adapting the story, he initially tried to keep Pinocchio's brashness and hoped that, with the help of animation, he would be appealing. However, by June of 1938, it was clear that Pinocchio just wasn't a likable character. And Walt made the difficult decision to overhaul the film. Walt recognized the problem, quote, "People knew the story, but they don't like the character," end quote. After working on the film for 6 months, Walt scrapped the entire project and started from scratch. What a big and I'm sure very costly move.
Yeah, looks like a bad sign for Pinocchio. Early on, Pinocchio was drawn with clunky joints and movements, much like a real wooden puppet. Now, Pinocchio's design needed to convey his new sympathetic and innocent personality. Even Freddie Moore, who was known as the master of cute characters, was stumped by the challenge of making a wooden figure appealing. Animator Milt Kahl provided the changes that proved to be definitive. Discarding the idea that Pinocchio was a wooden boy, he drew him as a little human boy and added toy-like wooden joints. Walt was thrilled with Kahl's take on the character. This alteration was a turning point, both in the film and for Kahl's career. Walt was known to peek his head into the office and ask, "Where's the genius?"
What a legendary name to be called by what most would deem an actual genius, Walt Disney. Well, Milt Kahl served as a directing animator on Pinocchio, along with Frank Thomas, Fred Moore, Ward Kimball, and Vladimir, also known as Bill, Tytla. Kahl's approach to Pinocchio helped to save a floundering character and resulted in one of the most memorable Disney characters. 11-year-old Dickie Jones caught Walt's eye in his performance in the 1938 Warner Brothers film The Kid Comes Back. During the 19 months Dickie worked on Pinocchio, voicing the titular character, he also managed to complete roles in Mr. Smith Goes to Washington and Destry Rides Again, both starring Jimmy Stewart.
As Pinocchio says, "What's a conscience?" In Collodi's story, Jiminy Cricket was merely a talking cricket, less of a conscience and more of a philosopher that would give advice to Pinocchio. In the 4th chapter of the book, Pinocchio gets mad and smashes the cricket. The cricket character dies very early on in the story. The Disney story team went through several reimaginings of the character during early development of the film. Walt was insistent that the cricket play a more integral role of the story than what was depicted in the book. Here is story artist Joe Grant talking about the creation of Jiminy Cricket's character as we know him today.
Because he usually took home a briefcase full of material, books and whatnot, and it was always a pleasure to wait to see what he came up with on Monday morning. And particularly in the case of Pinocchio, which is an oversized volume written in an Italian story. In the translation, he read parts of it, but I always had the feeling he never read the entire story. I think he came back with with a much better one, which was all of his own improvisation. I think in the case of the cricket, which is not the case in the book, the cricket, I think, is smashed in the 3rd page, but he came to the idea that the cricket could be your conscience, and that is what the origin of it. It is purely Walt's origination.
At one point, the cricket character was going to be a vessel for the Blue Fairy, who brings Pinocchio to life. In another draft, he was a bumbling guide of Pinocchio who would give sage advice and suffer from temptation to the point that he also turns into a donkey along with Pinocchio on Pleasure Island. Here is Joe Grant again discussing Jiminy Cricket's growing role in the film.
Well, pretty much in all our pictures, we always had a sidekick. And the cricket, in a sense, gave a meaning to the picture, the idea of his conscience. And it was followed all the way through. But it was really an inspirational thing on his part, and it fit beautifully. He was great for spontaneous ideas. For instance, when Pinocchio and the Geppetto were locked inside of the whale, and they did something in there to tickle him, and the whale sneezes. And sneezes both of them out in their boat, out into the water. Walt looked at it and said, well, that's interesting. It's not bad. But he said, how about them saying Gesundheit, which was one of the biggest laughs that picture ever got.
With Jiminy Cricket's character story arc as Pinocchio's conscience ironed out in the story, there were still some concerns over his design. Walt went to veteran animator and future Disney legend Ward Kimball with the assignment of Jiminy Cricket. Here is an excerpt from an interview with Ward Kimball from the documentary Walt, the Man Behind the Myth.
He came right in the next conversation and said, but I've got a character for that you should work on. And it's we're setting up storyboards on Pinocchio, and I have this little creature, the cricket, and he's going to run through the whole plot. I'd like to have you work on it. And so right away I felt a little better that day because he was a salesman, and he changed the soup sequence into the enjoyment I would have with Jiminy Cricket.
Well, Kimball went to work on his design for Jiminy Cricket. The first design stayed true to Jiminy's insect-like characteristics, but wasn't appealing enough. Walt confirmed, exclaiming, it's too ugly. Kimball then went back to the drawing board and stripped away more and more distinct insect features. Kimball dubbed the character, quote, a blob, claiming, quote, it is not a cricket, it is a blob. It is a little man creature with no ears, and he wears little English outfits. And the only reminiscence of a cricket's wings are the tails of his coat. The audience accepts him as a cricket because the other characters say he is, end quote. Although Walt loved Kimball's redesign of the character, Kimball was never fully satisfied and ended up disliking the finished product. Years later, he said, quote, and I still hate him, end quote. Love the candor.
Wow, Ward, tell us how you really feel. Cliff Edwards' voice talent contributed yet another character change for Jiminy. Edwards was a well-known singer and actor who who was famous for his 1929 hit Singin' in the Rain, maybe you've heard of it, and his use of the ukulele. His lively personality and use of ad-libbed American slang changed how Jiminy would be portrayed in the finished film. Walt explained Edwards' effect on Jiminy, quote, "At first we made Jiminy a sort of pompous little fellow, kind of a windbag, you know. As it turns out, Cliff was somewhat responsible for changing Jiminy's character. Cliff's voice had so much life and fun in it that we altered the character to conform with the voice," end quote. As Jiminy's character became more defined, so did his role within the film. He ended up not just being Pinocchio's conscience, but also the narrator of the film. I think that was a good choice to follow Cliff Edwards' voice as far as it was going to go.
Adapting Geppetto to the screen, it proved difficult. Collodi's Geppetto was not a kindly old toy maker, as we're seeing with almost all the characters, not very kindly, but rather was notorious in his village for his bad temper. He lived in a bare room with little furniture, which added a contrast to the film's adaptation, in which artists filled his home with illustrious wooden furniture. The Disney writers determined to make Geppetto a more sympathetic character and introduced the idea of the old man longed for a son. This compassion and yearning for a child was another Disney creation. In an early draft, the film opened with Geppetto greeting the local school children and sniffling at the window because he had no child of his own. In one of the first story meetings, Walt is noted saying, quote, "I don't like that angle. You don't need it. He's a nice old fellow, and he'd like to have a son. Is there any reason to have him weep?" End quote. From the beginning, he argued for greater subtlety. Early in 1938, character actor Spencer Charters was recruited as the original voice and live-action model for Geppetto. Charter was one of the busiest voice actors in Hollywood and had appeared in more than 100 films. He seemed like a good fit for Geppetto.
The actor who ended up getting the role of Geppetto was Christian Rubb, who was also used as a visual reference for the character. He brought much-needed subtlety to the character of Geppetto. The fairy in Collodi's novel was more of an amorphous creature, whose character evolved throughout her appearances in the book. First, she was introduced in chapter 15 as a little girl with blue hair, which Collodi intended to be the last chapter of the book. When he resumed the story in chapter 16, the little girl, who claimed to be dead and waiting for a coffin, returned as a fairy who lived in the forest, quote, "for more than 1,000 years. She appeared periodically in the story, rescuing Pinocchio from his mischief. She eventually appeared as a grown woman and agreed to be Pinocchio's mother. All of this to say, her form in the original story was never straightforward. Walt knew the unlimited possibilities for this character in the medium of animation. He suggested in December 1937 story meetings, quote, "I'd like to see her as a little fairy. You could have a moth flying around the candle, the blue light appears, and the moth grows into the fairy, so that you get the idea right away that she is present in different forms." For a time, the story featured the blue fairy transforming into other creatures, such as a fish and a turtle during Pinocchio's undersea adventures. As time went on, however, her storylines whittled away, and the blue fairy's role became clearer. They leaned on her more as a maternal and nurturing character, and she eventually only transformed into the grown woman character that we recognize from the finished film.
Jack Campbell was given the task on bringing the blue fairy to life. He gave instructions to the inkers and painters that focused mainly on paying attention to her face, noting, quote, "When you watch a character on the screen, unless that character is doing an intricate dance step or juggling, the attention is focused on the eyes of that character. In slow dialogue, attention is focused on the eyes. That is a big point in the inking and painting," end quote. The studio filmed live-action reference footage for the Blue Fairy, first with radio actress Lorraine Tuttle, and then replaced with Marge Belcher, later known as Marge Champion, who also modeled for Snow White. Several actresses were tested for the voice of the fairy, but Evelyn Venable was cast. Her warm, cultured tones were just what the fairy needed and gave a sense of maternal concern to Pinocchio. As J.B. Kaufman, author of Pinocchio, The Making of the Disney Epic, details, quote, "Late in production, when some of her dialogue recordings were played for a group of studio staffers, The meeting notes reported, "Discussion of Fairy's husky voice, but Walt felt that it was good for a motherly character such as she is intended to be." End quote.
And the Blue Fairy wasn't the only side character to have gone through a pretty massive overhaul throughout the production of the film. Before there was Pinocchio, Geppetto filled his home with the love of his pets Figaro the cat and Cleo the goldfish. In Collodi's 1883 novel, Geppetto had a pet cat that played a minor role. The goldfish was purely a Disney creation. In an early script, Geppetto addresses his cat in a very telling exchange. Quote, "But what right have we to dream of children, a couple of old fogies like us?" End quote. This tells us that the cat was not always a kitten, as Figaro became, but in fact was originally conceived as much older. Walt suggested the cat be more of a screwball character used for comic relief. He based this version of the cat from a cat featured in a Mickey Mouse short of the time, The Worm Turns, from 1937.
The funnier cat didn't last long. During the reworking of Pinocchio and Geppetto's characters, the cat was reimagined as a kitten named Figaro. With lots of cute kitten comedy potential, Walt made a concerted effort to assign this character to Freddie Moore. Moore had animated cute kittens before in the Academy Award-winning short The Three Kittens in 1935. Walt was anxious to capture the qualities that Moore had brought to that short. However, it would be Eric Larson who contributed to the original rough animation of Figaro that Walt and Moore endorsed. He combined the kitten's character with the personality of a small boy and, in one famous instance, modeled Figaro's actions on those of his own 4-year-old nephew. By the end of the process, Figaro was an appealing character in his own right and an instant scene stealer. Larson emerged as a leading animator and a member of Walt's 9 Old Men.
Well, and that's such a good thing that Figaro went through that whole journey, because Figaro would become so popular that he would become Minnie Mouse's cat as well in later shorts. So look at that. As mentioned before, Cleo the goldfish did not originate from Collodi's story. Cleo began as a marginal character. It wasn't until March 1938 that Walt referred to the fish casually as a male goldfish named Ferdinand. This was during the production of the celebrated short Ferdinand the Bull that won the Academy Award. Less than 2 weeks later, the fish was established as female and named Cleo by Walt personally. She began to take shape as her personality grew as more of a puppy-like character, hopping out of the water when she's happy and wagging her tail like a puppy. Her visual design received a touch of feminine glamour. Her face appears as if she's wearing makeup on her eyes, cheeks, and lips, and she uses her fins like a veil. You may notice a passing family resemblance to the fish in the Nutcracker Suite segment in Fantasia. Because Figaro and Cleo often shared scenes together, Cleo was added to Eric Larson's Figaro unit. Larson animated some of her action himself. Of the junior artists who worked with him, it fell to Don Lusk to animate most of Cleo's close-ups. As Cleo's personality came into full bloom on the screen, Walt was immensely pleased with it. Quote, "That is going to be cuter than hell in this when she brushes against the finger like a cat." End quote.
Unlike with Snow White, there is not just one villain in the story. Pinocchio encounters numerous foils. There are so many villains in this story. It was a little crazy, and we're going to go through some of them here. The fox and the cat characters were pulled straight out of Collodi's novel. The fox had many of the traditional characteristics foxes had in children's literature, a sly and cunning personality. Walt suggested in a story meeting, quote, "It would plant the character of the fox and cat if you see them working a shell game," end quote. He improvised a scene in which the fox, delivering his spiel, and the cat, acting as a shill, fleeced the suckers on the street until they spotted Pinocchio on his way to school. Quote, "The fox uses gangster talk when he lets his hair down, talks out of the corner of his mouth, and when he's trying to get somebody, a victim at his own game, he really has a flow of language," end quote. It was quite the debate to determine the fox's name. Walt initially objected to the name Honest John because of how common of a name John was. Keeping in mind the fox's sense of self-importance, some options were J. Willoughby Fox, S. Ashbel Smith, and J. Overly Foulfellow. In the end, the writers reached a compromise. The character's name officially was J. Worthington Foulfellow, but in the film, he's addressed only as Honest John.
Note the anthropomorphized duo of the fox and the cat. They fit seamlessly in the film alongside a predominantly human cast. Much like Dopey in Snow White, the cat character ultimately appears in the film as a non-talking character. At one point in the story development, he was known tentatively as Me Too, a catchphrase that was periodically inserted into his dialogue. The name for the character used in the film is Gideon, or Giddy for short. While Honest John's voice and live-action model was popular character actor of the time Walter Catlett, the abandoned plan to portray the cat as a speaking character led to one of the great what-ifs of animation history. Mel Blanc, the versatile voice actor at Warner Brothers, was cast as Gideon's speaking voice. Blanc recorded dialogue at the Disney studio in the spring of 1938, but only one of Blanc's recorded hiccups from that session was used in the final film. The following year, once Gideon's character had been established as a non-talking character, they had Blanc return to record a fresh new assortment of hiccups and some miscellaneous donkey sounds for the sequences on Pleasure Island. Norm Ferguson, otherwise known as Fergie, was the supervising animator for Honest John and Gideon. He headed a unit of artists, including future Disney legend John Lounsbury. Lounsbury was responsible for many of the action sequences involving those characters, and was one of many artists that emerged as a leading animator after production on Pinocchio wrapped. Artist T. He teamed up with Ed Penner to develop gags for Honest John and Gideon. I don't know, is there a better gag artist than a T. He?
He was born for it.
T. He claimed that Walt was particularly taken with the scene in the Red Lobster Inn where the cat was pressed against the fox's ear, trying to hear what the coachman was whispering in the opposite ear. By 1938, he was promoted to the story department and assigned to direct 3 major Honest John and Gideon sequences.
Stromboli the Puppet Master was described by Collodi as Mangiofuoco, which translates to fire eater. The Disney writers originally kept this translation for their character, but they eventually landed on the name Stromboli, which came from the volcanic island of Stromboli in the Tyrrhenian Sea, off the north coast of Sicily. A great tie-in to Stromboli's volcanic temper. Vladimir, also known as Bill Tytla, developed the look of the character and imbued a veracity and power to his animation. He also lent his talents to another ferocious villain, Monstro.
For the coachman, his physical appearance was less threatening than Stromboli, but he arguably had a more inward evil. In an early conference, Walt suggested, quote, "We want to make a character out of the coachman. He's a villain, yet you like him in some way." Writers at one point had the idea that the coachman was in disguise and would remove his smiling mask to reveal a more sinister villain underneath. Does this remind anyone else of the villain reveal in Who Framed Roger Rabbit? For most of the coachman's screen time, his evil temperament is suggested through his treatment of the donkeys on Pleasure Island and his close-up in the Red Lobster Inn. Charles "Nick" Nichols animated most of the coachman's action. Actor Charles Joodles provided the voices and live-action reference for both the puppet master Stromboli and the coachman.
Amongst conmen, or animals, puppet masters, kidnappers, Pinocchio faces the danger of peer pressure from an older boy, Lampwick, who leads him astray. In Collodi's novel, the boy's name is Lucignolo, a name often translated to Candlewick, but more commonly known today as Lampwick. The development of Lampwick's character evolved into a more street-smart wise guy who might have stepped out of a gangster film. As early as November 1938, Walt warned writers away from modeling Lampwick's personality on the actor Mickey Rooney. The cast Frankie Darro, who was the quintessential tough kid in films such as Public Enemy and Wild Boys of the Road. Lampwick's swaggering strut was styled after the live-action model Clyde Cook, who acted out the scenes at the studio. Freddie Moore initially assumed to animate Pinocchio and Figaro, the most appealing characters in the film, ended up animating Lampwick. adding the much-needed mischief to Lampwick's character.
I think we really need to examine the link between like the gangster films of the 30s with Pinocchio, because clearly there was a lot of influence there that's just waiting to be examined. Monstro, named after the Portuguese word for monster, traces his origins to chapter 26 of Carlo Collodi's original The Adventures of Pinocchio, called, quote, The Terrible Dogfish. The dogfish is described as big as a mountain or larger than a 5-story building, which proved difficult for Disney animators to surmount, pun intended. Interesting because animation is such a limitless medium, but you really do need to have a design in mind first, right? You can't just be like, this character is going to be huge, draw it. It takes a little bit more than that. As J.B. Kaufman, author of Pinocchio, The Making of a Disney Epic, details, quote, Monstro compounded the usual problems of convincing movement in animation. Here, the movement must not only be smooth, but must suggest the sheer geographic area covered by the whale, end quote. What made Monstro such a murderous adversary, according to historian John Canemaker, is his capacity to feel. He was bad, and he knew it. Wolfgang, known as Wooly Reitherman, was given the task of cleaning up the rough work by Vladimir Bill Teitla, already in charge of the imposing and volatile showman Stromboli and animating what would become the monumental Monstro. This was an important collaboration, as Teitla's departure following the animator strike in 1941 afforded Reitherman the chance to fill his role in animating intense characters and sequences in the future.
Walt said, quote, they get ready, and the sneeze blows them out. And as the whale comes into another sneeze, and the inhale starts drawing them back, they have to paddle hard against it. The underwater stuff is a swell place for the multiplane, diffusing and putting haze in between, with shafts of light coming down. I would like to see a lot of multiplane in this, end quote. Walt's commitment to utilizing the most sophisticated technology at his disposal for Pinocchio's many effects-driven sequences is evident in the final product. Walt recounted a desire he had to make his picture more believable and lifelike. Quote, I wanted to get certain effects for a feature. I felt like I had to get a certain feeling of depth in things. I couldn't just have the flatness. And that's what we now call the multiplane camera, where instead of it being a painting on one plane, we make the painting into several planes, and then we can move the camera through the planes, and that gives an illusion of depth, you see, end quote.
I do see. And in fact, let's go into another sequence using the multiplane. A standout sequence in the film is number 2, Goes to School. The birds fly down and the clock tower bell rings as the camera view seemingly glides down through the village to Pinocchio going off to school. Technician Bill Garrity designed an expanded version of the original multiplane camera crane, this time working on a horizontal plane that stretched across an entire room, yielding a greater freedom of movement. Walt's team created a camera motion unlike any other. I mean, this is such a cool part of multiplane camera history that it's not just the big ol' several story one that we have in our galleries, but there are also additional kind of ancillary multiplanes that accomplish different effects. Historian John Canemaker would agree as he describes about the sequence, quote, one of the most renowned and complex shots, end quote, of Walt's time. Quote, the time-consuming, painstaking effort expended on this single scene by dozens of personnel resulted in one of the most expensive single shots in an animated film at the time. Now, at the time of Pinocchio, Walt was willing, if not insistent, to ensure the utmost quality and detail in every element of the film. The richness of a feature film could be as limitless as Walt's imagination. In reality, the environment was 5 large glass paintings propped up in mechanical frames, lit from all sides, with the camera slowly proceeding through one frame at a time. The result was pure magic.
And you can see multiplane number 12 from above and below in the museum galleries. It's really one of our favorites, and we can't stop talking about it.
It also seems to be a favorite of a lot of the guests that we've had on our Museum Musing podcasts. So that's something that a lot of people from different parts of Disney fandom all love to geek out over the multiplane camera.
But yeah, there are only 3 multiplane cameras in the world. It's really such a sight to see. There's one at the Walt Disney Studios in Burbank, the Walt Disney Studios Park at Disneyland Paris, and at the Walt Disney Family Museum. So actually kind of a fun little story. A few years ago, we had a question about what the number 12 indicated on our multiplane camera on display. Like, what did it mean? We had a lot of theories. It was kind of fun to speculate, but we went to the source. I contacted the Walt Disney Archives to inquire what the different numbers would have indicated. And they got in touch with Don Iwerks, son of Ub Iwerks, who was a former head of the studio, machine shop, and camera service department. And Don's response was, quote, "The numbers correspond to the camera department room numbers. The multiplane camera rooms were numbered 11, 12, and 14. Note the absence of number 13, commonly felt to be unlucky, so it was skipped," end quote. What a fun fact.
It makes a whole lot of sense because animators seem to be very superstitious, so we can forgive them for not labeling their rooms correctly. But multiplane room number 14, you know what room you really are. After Snow White's record-breaking success, other cartoon studios jumped on the coattails and announced their own feature-length films of their own. A serious contender was Gulliver's Travels, produced by Max Fleischer. Fleischer produced many successful cartoons, including Out of the Inkwell and Betty Boop, and was a figure in the animation industry that Walt looked up to during his early years. Paramount distributed the film and announced the release date as late 1939. This was the same general date that Disney had already announced for Pinocchio. Behind closed doors, Disney executives were concerned that Gulliver's Travels wouldn't be produced at the same standard as Disney films at the time and would sour the audience to animated films going forward. If you recall, Snow White dispelled the notion that audiences wouldn't sit through an 80-minute animated film, but the jury was still out on what audiences would ultimately tolerate. RKO, Disney's distributor, fought to have Pinocchio released before Fleischer's. However, Gulliver's Travels opened in December 1939 with mixed audience reviews and tepid critical praise. It was hard not to compare Snow White and Gulliver's Travels. In January 1940, a month before Pinocchio's release, a new theatrical trailer premiered that included the prominent line, quote, "And now Walt Disney brings you his first and only full-length feature since Snow White," end quote. Walt wanted there to be no confusion.
On Christmas Day, radio audiences were introduced to Walt Disney's Pinocchio on the Lux Radio Theater program on CBS. Cecil B. DeMille hosted, and Cliff Edwards, Dickie Jones, Christian Reb, and Walter Catlett repeated their roles for the Lux broadcast. The script for this hour-long broadcast was pretty faithful to the film, allowing for some condensing, utilizing Jiminy Cricket's role as the narrator to better illustrate the scenes for the radio audience. Cliff Edward proved himself well-suited as a narrator. Disney called on him throughout the years to reprise his role as Jiminy Cricket. Now here's a really cool clip from Pinocchio on the Lux Radio Theater.
Walt is busy getting Pinocchio ready for its national screen release through RKO in February. And besides, Mr. Disney's moving into a fine new studio at Burbank, the house that Donald Duck, Mickey Mouse, and Snow White built. Tonight we introduce his latest characters for the first time in the house that Lux built. In 2 years of work on Pinocchio, 500 artists made about 2 million drawings of such likable people as Pinocchio himself, Jiminy Cricket, the Blue Fairy, and old Geppetto, the woodcarver. I feel we can make you see the beautiful color of the Disney picture as we bring you the story and spirit of Pinocchio. It's the spirit of all small boys who'd rather look for adventure than go to school. Now just put yourself in the place of Geppetto, the woodcarver. Suppose you had made a puppet, a little wooden boy, and then all of a sudden, the puppet began to talk and move about like a real boy. I believe you'd be ready for almost anything to happen. And that's the best frame of mind I can suggest for you now. As the Lux Radio Theater curtain goes up on Act 1 of Walt Disney's Pinocchio.
Good night, Pinocchio, little funny face. Look at him, Figaro. He almost looks alive. Wouldn't that be nice if he was a real boy? Oh, well, come on now, we go to sleep. Oh, Figaro, I forgot to open the window. Would you do it? Thank you, Figaro. Oh, Figaro, look up there in the sky, see? The wishing star. Starlight, star bright, first star I see tonight. I wish I might have the wish I make tonight. Figaro, do you know what I wish? I wished that my little Pinocchio might be a real boy. Wouldn't that be nice? Just think, a real boy.
A very lovely thought, but not at all practical. And with that, the old woodcarver turned over and went to sleep. Well, it was a nice night for it, so I decided to do the same. But just as I got settled in a comfortable position, the room was suddenly filled with starlight. Yes, sir, starlight. And it came right down in a long beam straight from that wishing star. And coming down along that beam, as I live and breathe, was a fairy. Yes, sir, a beautiful blue fairy.
It was really cool to hear this clip from the Lux Radio. It really was such a full preview of the entire film, which you think about today and, animated film trailers, and you barely know what you're going to see in the movie. And so this was one big advertisement to get people into the theaters, and it really was the whole movie.
Very cool, too, and very appropriate considering the medium of the time. I mean, this being a radio program, radio was king at that time, and it wouldn't be for another decade and a half before TV would start to encroach on it. So this was really the best way to advertise what the experience of Pinocchio was going to be like, and it seemed to do pretty well for that. So, Pinocchio premieres on February 7th, 1940, in New York at the Center Theater. On February 9th, Hollywood hosted a dual premiere for Pinocchio. The film was shown at the Pantages and Hill Street theaters. Pantages Theater held a gala premiere for the film with guests such as Marlene Dietrich, Ginger Rogers, Spencer Tracy, Harpo and Groucho Marx, those fun guys, Cary Grant, and many more. Most of the major voice talents from the film attended too, and press photographers were delighted when Dickie Jones arrived with Darla Hood of Our Gang fame on his arm. Coachman notes in his book, Pinocchio, The Making of a Disney Epic, that within the film community, Walt received many personal wishes on Pinocchio. Producer Walter Wanger wrote to Walt saying, quote, "I think Pinocchio is the most marvelous thing I've ever seen. You have excelled yourself." Director Frank Capra wired, quote, "I cried and I laughed and I wondered and I admired. It's your best hit, Walt, which means it's up there all by itself. Congratulations." Fletcher Boron, mayor of Los Angeles at the time, declared Saturday the 10th, the day after the premiere, Pinocchio Day in his city.
As Pinocchio opened in other cities, there were lackluster box office returns. Had Snow White not been a runaway success, Pinocchio's opening would have been more than adequate. Walt, along with the rest of the industry, predicted that it would equal or surpass the success of their first film. Although Pinocchio had plenty of critical acclaim, it suffered due to World War II's impact on the European film distribution market. It made back the cost during Pinocchio's second theatrical run in 1945. This clip is Walt with journalist Pete Merton in 1956, reflecting back on the release of Pinocchio.
The second one I made following Snow White was Pinocchio. It was a big disappointment to a lot of people. And as a lot of them said, no dwarfs, Well, time had to play its part. Pinocchio has become a perennial. You see? Pinocchio has been reissued and gone out, and it was an entirely different kind of story, you see? And Pinocchio, Snow White cost $1,700,000. Pinocchio went up and cost $2,600,000 before I got through with it.
Why? That cost gone up that much at that time?
Well, yes, techniques. You see, we begin to find out we could do things and everything, and boy, we went into effects and things that were very costly. At the same time I was doing Pinocchio, I started Fantasia.
Well, how did Pinocchio make out?
Well, it cost $2,600,000, and it was released at a time when the world was kind of collapsing. So it didn't do so well.
By collapsing, you mean that Chamberlain was going over talking to Hitler?
All of that, well, they declared war in 1939, remember?
But I don't know the date of Pinocchio.
Well, it was shortly after that all of our revenue was frozen from over there. And as soon as the invasion of Europe came with Hitler, your markets collapsed. Our English pounds were frozen. Our financing just shrunk right down to what was left of the world, and the bank cut you right off. They would discount every nickel we had in England, you see.
What percentage of your profit growth was coming from worldwide?
We were running, I'd say 45% of our world gross was from outside of the United States and Canada, you see.
And this happened in the middle of Pinocchio?
Well, I had several things. I had Bambi being completed, and then I started, finished Pinocchio, overlapped Bambi, Dumbo came later, started Fantasia, and I had all of this product in work. In other words, as soon as Snow White hit, I said, well, we got to go into the features. We got to begin to make features. And there was no denying it after it grossed $8 million, you see, so it was a matter of getting money for it.
Wow, that was certainly a telling quote from Walt, talking about just how difficult it was to see Pinocchio make money during World War II. Obviously, the European markets being cut off and the funds being frozen there during the war didn't help the company. And of course, as we see with our current special exhibition, the Walt Disney Studios in World War II, Walt would then take the company in the direction of supporting the war effort to keep the studios going before they could take on full feature-length film projects again. Now, it's time for our favorite segment, Fun and Fancy Facts, where we share some of our favorite facts about today's topic. Number 1, our Pinocchio exhibition. I have memories working this. Wow, that would be 5 years ago now, yeah. In 2016, the Walt Disney Family Museum celebrated the second Disney animated feature film with a special exhibition of its own, Wish Upon a Star, The Art of Pinocchio. The exhibition was curated by John Canemaker, an Academy Award, Emmy Award, and Peabody Award-winning independent animator, historian, teacher, and author. The exhibition featured more than 300 objects and even included an immersive Geppetto's workshop, showcasing some of the character models from the film. This exhibition had an accompanying book by historian J.B. Kaufman called Pinocchio, The Making of the Disney Epic. This book was a great resource for this episode. Underneath the dust jacket reveals a wood embossing, a very cool design feature. You can order the book on our web store at waltdisney.org/store.
Number 2, Character Model Department. Walt established the Character Model Department in late 1937 as an effort to create reference models for artists to utilize during the production process. The department was established during the production of Pinocchio, Fantasia, and Dumbo. Joe Grant, previously a story artist, led the department. Here is Grant explaining how the Character Model Department came to be.
Well, it was one of those conferences in the hall. His first question was, what are we going to do for an encore? And that's where he more or less said, let's do some experimenting. Let's do some research and see what we can come up with, which was the result of that was the model department and Pinocchio. That was actually the origin of it. I mean, there was never anything ceremoniously about what he did. It was always spontaneous. And if he said, let's create a model department, we did. That was the magician in him.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. If Walt says, let's create a model department, then it was probably good to do just that. The early models created in the character model department were created using plasticine, a non-drying clay, and then cast in plaster with an underlying steel wire armature. They were then finished in the ink and paint department, and then they were ready for animators to check out for reference material. We have many character models from Pinocchio. A unique model in our collection is a plasticine sculpture of Monstro made for production. This one's particularly unique as most maquettes, like I said, were cast in plaster after their initial sculpt in plasticine. However, this model was painted and distributed as is. The object was never intended to last almost 80 years when it was ultimately donated to the Walt Disney Family Museum. When the object arrived at the museum, it was in poor condition. Most of his tail was detached, exposing metal rods and internal wood supports. There was a lot of paint damage. Our 3D object conservationist Tanya Morris carried out a conservation treatment of the piece to stabilize it enough to go on view in that special exhibition, Wish Upon a Star, The Art of Pinocchio. The character model department only operated from 1937 to 1941, but it greatly impacted the animation process. To this day, techniques like model sheets and character model sculptures help to maintain an animated character's consistency throughout a film.
Number 3, deleted scenes. There were many storylines and songs that were left on the cutting room floor. One song that was ultimately cut featured Honest John, called As I Was Saying to the Duchess. This song was replaced by Hi Diddly Dee. There was originally a song called Off to Pleasure Island that was considered much too pleasant for the direction of the film and was cut. According to J.B. Coachman, quote, it suggested a genteel chorus on their way to tea, rather than a mob of boys bent on unlimited license, end quote. A notable deleted scene featured Pinocchio's underwater adventures. In this scene, Pinocchio begins his search of the ocean floor where he meets fish, a sunken ship, and an octopus. In Pinocchio's ensuing struggle with the octopus, it isn't until Pinocchio utters Monstro's name that the octopus fearfully releases him.
Monstro. Ooh. Number 4, awards. Pinocchio received 2 Academy Awards for Best Score and Best Song for When You Wish Upon a Star, the first competitive awards won by an animated feature. You might be surprised, like, didn't that small film, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, win an Oscar? It did. However, the special honorary Academy Award for Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs wasn't in a competitive category. It was just a special award for that achievement. Snow White was also nominated in music categories as well, but didn't win. So Pinocchio was the first competitive award wins by an animated feature. And as you'll know, the Best Animated Feature category at the Oscars wouldn't even be introduced until the 21st century. In the museum's awards lobby, you can see a special award for a very special kitten. Figaro received Best Animal Actor from the Ohio State Persian Club in 1940. Congrats, Figaro.
It's one of my favorite awards to point out.
Had a lot of stiff competition, I'm sure.
Number 5, Jiminy Cricket. Now, Jiminy Cricket became an instant star after his premiere in Pinocchio. His character would later appear in Disney films and television shows as a narrator. He appeared in Fun and Fancy Free and the Mickey Mouse Club. I love when we can work in a Fun and Fancy Free into our Fun and Fancy Facts.
Yeah, it just makes total sense. In conclusion, the circumstances in which Pinocchio was made are what help its case to be one of the most consequential films that Walt ever produced. The profits from Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs provided him with much-needed funds that would be reinvested into his studio and his artists, and that he did in the form of Pinocchio's technical brilliance.
As Walt once said, if, quote, there could be no compromise on money, talent, or time, end quote, in creating Snow White, the freedom offered by its own runaway success ensured the highest possible quality for its successor.
Well, speaking of money, talent, and time, this free podcast featuring the talents of Bri and I is at its end. Make sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at WDF Museum to stay updated.
You can also visit our website at waltdisney.org to learn more about visiting the museum, Walt's life, and upcoming special programs and events.
Thanks for wishing on a star with us, and keep moving forward.